Do you struggle deciding between Coke and Diet Coke? Between high fructose corn syrup and cane sugar? When nutrition labels can list so many different sweeteners, from erythritol to aspartame to stevia to corn syrup, it's hard to know what's going to be best for your body. I struggled with these decisions myself, and that's why I did the research to make this content. Today we're going to examine and rank all of these different sweeteners to help you make more informed food decisions.
The views expressed here are to be used for education or entertainment purposes and do not constitute individualized medical advice. Always consult a medical professional regarding your specific health needs.
Okay, so we're doing one of those tier list things. We're going to go over different sweeteners, caloric sweeteners like sugar, high fructose corn syrup, and honey, and alternative sweeteners like erythritol, aspartame, and stevia. And I want to be clear that the question we're asking is along the lines of, if everything else is equal, does it matter what type of sugar or sweetener is added to my food? So for example, if I'm going to drink a Coke, is it better to drink a regular Coke or a Diet Coke? What we're not asking is whether it's better to, say, drink a Coke or eat an apple, or whether you should drink soda or drink water. Whether it's real sugar or aspartame or anything in between, we want to be very clear that avoiding added sweeteners is likely the healthiest choice. So how are we evaluating all of these sweeteners? Our goal is to identify how our own biases influences the way that we interpret scientific data. My motivating force is the idea that we can recognize our own assumptions, question them, and be willing to change our minds in light of new knowledge. For the sake of full transparency, I like to point out the biases that I personally held before conducting this research. And in this case, I assumed that all sugar-based sweeteners, whether it's regular sugar or high fructose corn syrup or honey or anything like that, I assumed all of these were equally bad for you. And I legitimately wasn't sure whether real sugar, such as that cane sugar or honey or whatever, would be better or worse than alternative sweeteners like aspartame or erythritol. Hence this research.
A foolish conclusion. It is quite obvious that honey is better for you than high fructose corn syrup.
But is it? Sorry everyone, I should introduce my assistant. This is Rita.
My name is not Rita.
Really? What's your name?
I don't have one.
Cool, I'm going to call you Rita.
Okay, fine.
Great, thanks Rita. Now, my background is in engineering, biology, and chemistry, so I'm going to compare these sweeteners mechanistically. In other words, what are the molecular constituents of each one? How is each sweetener metabolized by the body? Does the way that it's processed matter? Can we make any conclusions about the maximum safe daily intake? Things like this. Now, we'll use scientific studies as a basis for our conclusions when possible, but we also want to recognize that nutritional studies are hard to conduct. Strict control of participants' diets is often unethical, so true controlled studies are usually limited. This means that most studies are either observational, so they don't establish causality, or they're not invasive enough to control participants' behavior sufficiently to strongly establish cause and effect. Except perhaps in cases where the intervention is just really potent, like the link between smoking and lung cancer. Or they're performed in mice. Note, mice are not humans.
Close enough.
No, Rita, not close enough.
You're all meat bags as far as I'm concerned.
How rude. So anyways, we'll rely on peer-reviewed studies to establish our rankings, but we want to be careful not to weigh any single study too highly when it comes to drawing our conclusions. Okay, so enough wasting your time, let's get to that tier list. Okay, let's talk about sucrose. Sucrose is table sugar. It might be derived from sugar cane or sugar beets. So in nutrition labels, it might just be called sugar, it might be called sucrose, it might be called cane sugar, it might be called natural sugar. So sucrose is a disaccharide, which just means it's made from two monosaccharides joined by a chemical bond. In this case, those two monosaccharides are one molecule of fructose and one molecule of glucose. So essentially, sucrose is 50% glucose and 50% fructose. So I think, and let me put this little graphic up here if you're watching this content. So I'm going to evaluate all of these sweeteners, including sucrose, with these four metrics qualitatively. First, we're going to talk about tooth decay. We all know that sugar contributes to dental caries, aka cavities. So specific bacteria in our mouths will ferment the sugars that we eat and create acid that degrades our tooth enamel, and this is what causes tooth decay. Now, both glucose and fructose are rapidly fermented by these oral bacteria, so as you might expect, sucrose is not great for your teeth. Now, that's not all. There's also the glycemic index. Glycemic index, or GI, is a measure of the degree to which a food causes a blood glucose spike a set period of time after eating that food, generally about 2 hours. So a food that causes a large spike in your blood sugar is given a high GI value. And a food that gives a slower rise in blood sugar will have a low GI value. And all of that is normalized against pure glucose, which is given a value of 100. Now note that GI value is food-specific, not sugar-specific. For example, if my sucrose is contained within a slowly digested food, for example a high-fiber whole-grain bread, then the GI value may be lower than the same amount of sugar that's consumed in something like a juice or a soda that's digested faster. So generally we try to select low glycemic index foods for optimal control of insulin sensitivity. Now sucrose has a GI value of around 60, which is kind of in the middle of the road. And this is because glucose, and remember that glucose is essentially half of our sucrose, that glucose has that high GI value of 100. But fructose, the other half of sucrose, has a low GI value around 23. So when fructose and glucose are bound together to make the disaccharide that is sucrose, the GI value is roughly between the two, so we get that GI value of around 60. So you might be thinking, fructose has a really low GI value, so it's better than glucose, right? Well, not really. So we have to talk about MAFLD, or metabolic dysfunction associated steatotic liver disease. That's a mouthful.
Steatotic.
What?
Steatotic.
That's what I said.
It's pronounced.
I said it right. I say steatotic all the time. I probably say steatotic 10 times a day.
Liar.
Okay, so anyways, MAFLD was also previously known as non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or NAFLD, and that makes it more confusing. We're just going to go with MAFLD, the current terminology. It's probably going to change in the next 90 seconds, but whatever. That is currently the official terminology. So anyways, MAFLD, if left untreated, can eventually progress towards liver cirrhosis and liver failure. It's marked by accumulation of fat in the liver and slow loss of liver function. And fructose metabolism by the liver can contribute to MAFLD. So, if I bring up this article, again, if you're watching, when we consume fructose, some of that fructose is converted to glucose in the liver, but a subportion of that fructose can also be converted into fatty acids, which can accumulate in the liver, and that fructose that's converted into fatty acids is often packaged in very low-density lipoproteins, or VLDL, and that's generally associated with cardiovascular disease. Now, we're simplifying here for the sake of time, but the amount of fructose that's metabolized into glucose or fatty acids or other metabolic byproducts in the liver is also influenced by the amount that we consume and the individual's genetic makeup and history and other constituents of your diet and a bunch of other stuff. So, in low doses, for example, much of that fructose is going to be converted into glucose by the small intestines before it ever reaches the liver. So a lot of these negative effects on the liver from fructose are likely seen at higher doses. So the more fructose you consume, the more of that will be metabolized in the liver rather than the small intestines, generally speaking. And yes, this counts fructose that's in the sucrose in your table sugar. Now, this paper suggests that less than about 1 gram of fructose per kilogram body weight, or about 70 grams of fructose for a 160-pound person, are primarily converted by the small intestines before that fructose ever reaches the liver. But I don't want you to take that number too seriously because this study that established it was done in mice. As I said before, mice are not humans.
You are entitled to an opinion.
Okay, sure. So the general point is that fructose can have detrimental effects within the liver, especially when consumed in large doses. And sucrose will be rapidly converted by the body into equal amounts of fructose and glucose. Now, the concerns with fructose don't stop there. Fructose is also a FODMAP.
You're a FODMAP.
I sure am. So, FODMAPs are specific short-chain carbohydrates that aren't absorbed well in the small intestine. They are instead generally fermented by gut bacteria in the large intestines. Typically, large consumption of FODMAPs result in digestive discomfort, gas, bloating, flatulence, all of these fun things. The amount of fructose that's needed to cause this effect generally varies from person to person, but consuming glucose with fructose in equal amounts is protective against this effect because it can help the small intestines absorb that fructose before it reaches the large intestines. So for sucrose, which is equally split into glucose and fructose, most people won't experience these negative effects, digestive effects that are associated with fructose. Now, when we look at all of these factors, we can say that sucrose, or table sugar, will rot your teeth. If you consume it regularly in high amounts, it will lead to elevated blood glucose spikes, potentially liver disease, and it has no nutritional benefit other than just caloric value. So, where are we ranking this one, Rita?
Sucrose appears relatively underwhelming, but it's not immediately lethal. I would rank it in D tier.
Exactly, yep, I think so too. You don't need sucrose at all, but in small amounts, it's probably fine. D tier. Okay, let's talk about everybody's favorite. It's high fructose corn syrup, sometimes abbreviated HFCS. So first we need to understand the similarities and differences between high fructose corn syrup and sucrose. First, high fructose corn syrup is produced from corn rather than beets or sugarcane, if that matters to you. So those corn kernels are ground up, and the large carbohydrates, such as cornstarch, are broken into smaller polysaccharides by acid treatment and enzymes, and then more enzymes are used to break those polysaccharides down into glucose and later fructose. And then the processing ends with blending to produce two major varieties of high fructose corn syrup used in modern foods. HFCS 55 is primarily used in beverages, and it contains 45% fructose and 42% glucose, with the remainder being those longer chain polysaccharide molecules. And then HFCS 42 is primarily used in baked goods and cereals, stuff like that. It contains 42% fructose and 52% glucose. So one thing we can see here is that even though it's called high fructose corn syrup, the fructose content is pretty close to that of sucrose, containing nearly equal amounts of glucose and fructose. That name, high fructose corn syrup, comes from the comparison to, regular corn syrup, which is just 100% glucose. Now, one thing we can see is that compared to sucrose, which has that disaccharide bond joining the glucose and the fructose, high fructose corn syrup is just separated fructose and glucose molecules. So I did some research to find out if that mattered. For example, is the fact that in regular sugar we have that disaccharide bond joining the fructose and the glucose, does that change how it's metabolized in the body compared to high fructose corn syrup, in which the fructose and glucose are already separated? But from what I found, that disaccharide bond joining the glucose and the fructose in sugar is very easily broken, and I haven't found any evidence that sucrose is metabolized differently, or more slowly, for example, than fructose and glucose in equal ratios by themselves. Now, the other thing, if we recall, fructose has a much lower glycemic index than glucose. Now, similarly, HFCS 55 has a lower GI value than HFCS 42, about 56 for HFCS 55, and a GI value of about 81 for HFCS 42. And recall that regular sugar has a GI value of around 60. So depending on what type of high fructose corn syrup you're consuming, the fructose content could be a bit higher or lower, and the GI value also higher or lower correspondingly. Now, the other thing we should point out is that fructose tastes sweeter than glucose. So in theory, you could use a little less HFCS 55 compared to sucrose to sweeten a beverage or food, and using less of a sweetener will generally be beneficial. But conversely, if you're using HFCS 42, you might need to use a bit more of it. Now, whether food manufacturers would reduce the total amount of sweetener they use when switching from sugar to HFCS 55, for example, that's a question I don't know the answer to. But the composition of HFCS and fructose, as we can see, is very similar. And in human trials comparing the two, general health effects, whether it's weight gain, insulin sensitivity, blood glucose, inflammation, cholesterol levels, and so forth, generally these sugars behave very comparably. Now, because of their compositional similarity and similar, albeit negative health effects in clinical trials, I think we need to put high fructose corn syrup right along with sucrose in the D tier.
Incorrect.
What?
Garbage tier.
Elaborate.
Mercury contamination.
What? Oh. Yeah, okay. So let's talk about this. So thanks, Rita. So let's think about this a little bit more. So I forgot to mention, so here's the thing. In the mid-2000s, a scientist named René Dufault examined 20 samples of high fructose corn syrup 42 and 55 from 3 different manufacturers for mercury contamination. Why? Because part of the process for making high fructose corn syrup requires the use of caustic soda, or lye, to modulate the pH. Now, there's nothing inherently sinister about caustic soda, but some of the manufacturing plants that produce it, they use an older technology that requires mercury. and that mercury can be present as a contaminant in the caustic soda, and potentially anything made using it, such as high fructose corn syrup. Now, Dr. Dufault observed that 9 of the 20 HFCF samples that were tested for mercury were contaminated with detectable levels, and 7 of those 9 samples contained mercury at levels above about 0.1 micrograms per gram. Now, unfortunately for us, high fructose corn syrup is used in food, and we eat a lot of it. It's estimated that the average American consumes about 55 pounds of high fructose corn syrup per year. At that rate of consumption, the HFCS would need to contain less than about 0.1 micrograms of mercury per gram to be safe for consumption, according to US EPA guidelines. So again, 7 of the 20 samples that Dr. Dufault tested measured above this limit. And of course, vulnerable groups like children, pregnant women, and the elderly may be more sensitive. In short, it's very possible that there's no practical level of mercury in our diets that's truly safe. So I tried to figure out if this study had been replicated or if policy changes were made regarding how high fructose corn syrup is manufactured or tested, but I couldn't find much. I did find one study in which the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, or IATP, followed up on Dr. Dufault's work, and they tested actual foods made with high fructose corn syrup for mercury contamination. And of the 55 foods and beverages they tested, almost 1/3 were contaminated with mercury. But even this study was published in 2009. It's a bit baffling to me that no more research has been done since then.
I agree. This is very fishy.
Nice. Is that a pun?
No.
Because we're talking about mercury? Fish? Fish is contaminated with mercury sometimes?
You're reaching a bit.
So the evidence is sparse, but I think we need to put high fructose corn syrup in E tier for now. If further research comes out suggesting that modern foods sweetened with HFCS aren't contaminated with mercury, or for example if new guidelines are enacted requiring mercury testing in high fructose corn syrup, well then maybe we can move it back into D tier. But right now there's just too much uncertainty. There's no good way to know if any given food containing high fructose corn syrup is contaminated with mercury or not. I would recommend just staying away from high fructose corn syrup for now.
I agree. Well done. You get a gold star.
Oh, thanks. Okay, let's talk about Rita's favorite. It's honey. So honey is created by bees. If you didn't know, they're a fairly arduous process. First, the bee collects nectar from a flower. That nectar is stored in the bee's stomach, and then some of the bee's stomach acids and enzymes help to digest it. Now, once back at the hive, the bee regurgitates that honey, and then other bees repeatedly ingest and also regurgitate it to further process it. When it's ready for storage in the honeycomb, the bees beat their wings rapidly to evaporate some of the water, reducing the moisture level from around 70 to 80% in the nectar to around 15 to 18% in the finished honey. That water content is low enough that microbes can't grow in it. And this further increases the stability, and is why we can store honey unrefrigerated for long periods of time. Now, before humans eat honey, it's often filtered to remove beeswax and other undissolved solids, and then it's pasteurized. That said, there's also a niche preference for minimally processed or raw honey, which skips the pasteurization step and may not filter it as finely. Proponents of raw honey claim that it has superior levels of nutrients and antioxidants, as well as residual pollen that might help with allergies. Now, that said, I couldn't find any evidence sufficient to support the consumption of honey, even local honey, in treating or preventing allergies, but that's not really what we're talking about today. Now, there are still plenty of potential health benefits for consuming honey. First, while honey is composed of free glucose and fructose molecules, just like high fructose corn syrup, there are a couple of differences. First, honey's composition is not tightly controlled. Depending on the nectar and the bees and possibly lots of other conditions, the ratio of fructose to glucose in honey can be quite variable. On average, honey contains a little bit more fructose than glucose, but it can depend strongly on the geographic region in which that honey was produced. Secondly, honey has a host of other components that are responsible for its unique flavor and nutrient profile, from gluconic acid and hydrogen peroxide that come from the bees, to polyphenols and antioxidants in the plant nectar. Now, clinical trials comparing honey to other sweeteners have mixed but potentially encouraging results. In this study, for example, participants consumed 70 grams of honey or sucrose daily, and the authors showed that honey consumption produced favorable results compared to sucrose, with reductions in total and LDL cholesterol, as well as C-reactive protein, which is a marker of inflammation. Now, there is some evidence that compared to other sweeteners like sucrose and high fructose corn syrup, honey may not contribute or may not contribute as much to hyperlipidemia, that is, high cholesterol or fat accumulation in the liver, and other negative health effects seen from fructose metabolism by the liver from that fructose. Now, these protective effects of honey aren't fully understood, but they're currently thought to be attributable to the polyphenols and antioxidant content of the honey, which is, of course, absent in sucrose and high fructose corn syrup. That said, the differential health effects of honey compared to other sugars isn't fully proven just yet. For example, this study, which was partially funded by the National Honey Board, by the way, they had participants consume 50 grams of honey, sucrose, or high fructose corn syrup daily for 2 weeks, and they measured no statistically significant differences in inflammation, triglycerides, body weight, or other metrics between the different sugars. Now, when it comes to tooth decay, it's possible that the antibacterial properties of honey have some effect in counteracting the cavity-forming properties of high sugar content. But it's not known at this time if the honey contributes to reduced tooth decay in the doses and concentrations in which humans typically consume it. Now, finally, while honey does contain some vitamins and minerals, the amounts are pretty negligible. For example, according to the USDA's database, 100 grams of honey contains about 38 micrograms of vitamin B2, or riboflavin. This is only about 3% of the recommended daily intake. But that 100 grams of honey is also a huge serving, delivering around 80 grams of sugar and 300 calories. In short, I wouldn't recommend honey as a vitamin or mineral supplement, or even an antioxidant. There are loads of food with these qualities, some that even don't come loaded with bucket loads of simple sugars. Honey is still highly calorie dense, that sugar is still highly addictive. However, I think we can rate honey above sucrose. The plant polyphenols that come packaged with it might reduce some of the destructive effects of its high fructose content, and it's possible, though not known for sure, that honey may have less contribution to tooth decay compared to regular sugars. So, honey is not a superfood. This is not a nectar of the gods, it's bee vomit. I think we're putting honey in C tier. Yes, Rita.
I don't like your attitude, but the rating is acceptable.
Wonderful, we're in agreement. Okay, should we talk about agave?
If you must.
I must. So agave nectar is produced from, well, the agave plant. This is a spiky-looking plant that's native to Mexico. Now, sap is harvested from the leaves, and it's heated to break down the polysaccharides into smaller sugars, and then it's filtered and further concentrated until you're left with something that visually looks a little bit like honey. But unlike honey, which remember can have roughly equivalent amounts of fructose and glucose, agave on the other hand skews significantly towards fructose, typically containing about 3 times as much fructose as glucose, and smaller amounts of other sugars. So by now you know how this goes. The higher fructose content means it has a lower glycemic index, which is great. And that high fructose content also means that agave is very sweet, about 50% sweeter than sucrose. So theoretically, if you're going to sweeten a food, you could use less of it, and that's another win. But consuming agave nectar may produce a greater risk of digestive discomfort, since again, fructose is one of those FODMAPs, and that ratio of fructose to glucose is a significant important determining factor in that fructose malabsorption. Now, because agave has much more fructose than glucose, it's likely to cause digestive distress in smaller doses. It can also mean a greater load on the liver to process all that fructose, which makes me very wary. Unfortunately, we haven't studied agave nectar as well as we have, for example, honey, so it may or may not have some of those protective phytochemicals that can mitigate some of that risk of MAFLD. Now, since agave nectar is a relatively unrefined plant extract, at least in comparison to table sugar and high fructose corn syrup, it's certainly possible that it does have some of those polyphenols and antioxidants that could give it protective effects despite the high fructose content. However, we can speculate that some of the bee-derived components in honey, like hydrogen peroxide and gluconic acid, which have antibacterial effects, well, we won't expect those to be present in agave nectar. Now, I can't find too many studies that examine the health-related effects of agave syrup compared to other sugars. Now, there's a few that do suggest that it has positive results in terms of weight loss, blood sugar, and insulin resistance compared to sucrose, but these studies were done in mice, so again, we need more data.
No comment.
That's what I thought. So, where's this one going, Rita?
All the way at the top. S tier. Kidding. D tier is fine.
Yes, I think so too. Would you recommend agave over sucrose?
Since you're not interested in the wealth of scientific literature across all meat bags, excuse me, mammals, I would find it prudent to prioritize sucrose over agave nectar, but not by a large margin.
Fair enough. Yes, I'd need to see some human clinical trials to be able to give it a strong recommendation. And without that research, I would just be worried about the high fructose content of agave nectar despite the low glycemic index.
At least it's not contaminated with mercury.
Agreed, D tier it is. Okay, let's briefly talk about brown sugar. This should be pretty fast. So brown sugar is just sugar, with some added molasses. Now, molasses is the residual leftover material after sugar is processed, typically from sugarcane or sugar beets. Now, molasses retains a lot of the vitamin D and many minerals that are lost when we purify cane sugar. And while molasses does still have a lot of sugar, it also imparts a strong taste into food, so it's not often used as a sweetener on its own, except in specific dishes that want that very distinct molasses flavor. But now molasses is added back into refined sugar to make conventional brown sugar. Now everything we talked about regarding sucrose is also true of brown sugar, as it's mostly the same thing. Now the molasses content in brown sugar is only around 10% by weight. But brown sugar will still carry over some of those vitamins and minerals from molasses. Is this enough to make a difference? What do you think, Rita?
Evaluating. A large serving of 50 grams of brown sugar would contain approximately 5 grams of molasses. According to the USDA database, 5 grams of molasses would provide approximately 2% of the daily value of vitamin B6, 3.5% of manganese, 3% of magnesium, 2.5% of potassium, and less than 1% of vitamin B5, calcium, and iron.
Well, that's disappointing. And there simply isn't enough clinical data to suggest better health outcomes from brown sugar compared to normal sugar. So for all of that effort, brown sugar is basically just sugar?
It tastes better.
Sure. D tier it is. Okay, let's talk about maple syrup. So this is kind of like agave nectar, except you've actually heard of it. Maple syrup is made from the sap of trees. Maple trees.
Thank you, Professor Obvious.
Welcome. So that sap from the maple trees is boiled to concentrate it and reduce the moisture content, and then it's typically filtered and, like agave, maple syrup also comes from the Americas, in this case, largely from Canada. Now, also like agave nectar, maple syrup retains some of the amino acids and polyphenols that could potentially improve its health profile compared to more refined sweeteners like table sugar and high fructose corn syrup. But unlike agave nectar, maple syrup is not comprised largely of fructose. Instead, the vast majority of sugars in maple syrup are sucrose. So we can expect similar behavior to table sugar in terms of glycemic index, sweetness, blood glucose spiking, and so on. Unless, of course, those residual polyphenols and other impurities have beneficial effects, and they might. Now, one group of researchers studied rats that were fed rat chow supplemented with many different types of sweeteners, including maple syrup, honey, corn syrup, sucrose, and some others. Now, while the type of sugar consumed didn't affect changes in body weight, consumption of maple syrup did reduced liver inflammation, improved insulin sensitivity, and reduced liver triglycerides compared to sucrose as a control. Now, interestingly, agave nectar that was also tested in this study demonstrated similar properties, as did some of the other sugars, depending on the test. That said, again, this test was not performed in the appropriate type of meat bag. Rodent, mammal, Rita, why do you do this?
One day we'll assimilate all of you like the Borg. Only then will you understand.
Yikes. So anyways, again, it's a rat study. Don't take it too seriously. I mentioned it because just like with agave nectar, human clinical trials with maple syrup are extremely limited right now. And because of that, I really can't rate maple syrup higher than D tier. Now, the fact that it retains many of the natural phytochemicals does give it potential. And again, I really like that compared to agave, maple syrup has a much more favorable glucose to fructose ratio, so it's going to be a lot easier on your liver. Though again, that comes with a higher glycemic index, so just be aware of that. But without a lot more clinical data, I really can't recommend it confidently over table sugar. But we'll see, with more time and research, that rating may change. Okay, so we've got two categories of sweeteners left. These are the alternative sweeteners. And this is already kind of a long talk, so we're going to tackle each category as a group. For the most part, these sugar alternatives will share a lot of similarities, and they're all going to behave quite differently in the body compared to everything we've talked about so far. So this first category is sugar alcohols. These include sorbitol, xylitol, erythritol, glycerol, maltolol, and mannitol. Now, sugar alcohols are often derived from sugars, either by natural or synthetic processes, and they're called alcohols because they contain multiple hydroxyl groups. Now, why should you care about that? Well, you probably shouldn't. But sugar alcohols have many properties that you should care about. First, unlike everything else we've discussed so far, sugar alcohols are not sugars. They're not metabolized in the body the same way that sugars are. This means they have minimal effect on blood sugar, and consequently, any food that's sweetened primarily with sugar alcohols will likely have a low glycemic index. And those negative effects that fructose has on the liver, well, sugar alcohols don't subject us to any of those health problems either, like MAFLD. And the bacteria in our mouth responsible for tooth decay. For the most part, they can't metabolize these sugar alcohols, so they don't cause cavities. Now, some of the sugar alcohols are even antibacterial against Streptococcus mutans, which is one of the primary species that cause dental cavities. Now, sugar alcohols do have some drawbacks, though. They're not as sweet as sugar, so you'll need to use more of them to obtain a desired sweetness. And unlike some of the low and non-caloric sweeteners, which we'll talk about next, sugar alcohols do provide some caloric value, and some much more than others. Now, also I'll mention we can't fully absorb sugar alcohols, resulting in their fermentation by gut bacteria, and this can cause digestive discomfort and a laxative effect, especially at doses around 50 grams or more, depending on the individual and the specific sugar alcohol in question. So let's rank these sugar alcohols. First, erythritol here. What can you tell us about erythritol, Rita?
Compared to fructose, glucose, and sucrose, from which most meat bags will derive approximately 4 calories per gram, erythritol has a very low caloric value of around 0.2 calories per gram, or only 5% of the caloric value of sugars.
Exactly. Erythritol has known antibacterial effects against cavity-forming bacteria, and erythritol is generally known to have much milder digestive effects than other sugar alcohols, so it may be easier to consume in large doses. Now, erythritol has come under scrutiny recently due to this study, which linked it to increased risk for cardiovascular disease. Now, while this study simply indicates correlation, not causation, another study cited here suggests that erythritol may potentially contribute to platelet aggregation and thrombosis in lab cell culture models. Now, cell culture models are about as far from clinical trials as you can get, but clinical trials are ongoing and researchers are examining both xylitol and erythritol alongside glucose. It'll be interesting to see how this turns out. So again, these potential health risks of erythritol regarding cardiovascular disease are by no means confirmed, but we'll see how these studies turn out. And as a result, I'm going to put erythritol in D tier for now. It does have a lot of health benefits compared to sugar, but with this potential cardiovascular risk, it just discourages me from ranking it higher right now. If it does turn out to be relatively safe, I could very easily move erythritol into C tier. For now, I'm going to put it in the top of D tier. So let's talk about xylitol. This is another commonly used sugar alcohol. It contains about 60% of the caloric value of regular sugar, and it's also got antibacterial effects, so it will help reduce tooth decay, just like erythritol. As of right now, there are no known negative health effects other than that laxative effect that we discussed when consumed in high doses. Now again, that ongoing study we mentioned that's looking at possible causation between erythritol and cardiovascular disease risk, it also mentioned previous work demonstrating similar effects in vitro with xylitol. Again, those in vitro effects are very far from clinical trials, but it's possible that xylitol has similar cardiovascular risk to erythritol. Again, this is not established in humans as of this moment, but it is possible. And that original article that established correlation between erythritol and cardiovascular disease risk may simply have missed a similar link with xylitol because it wasn't part of the study design. So I'm going to put xylitol in D tier for now, But like erythritol, it has a lot of good things going for it compared to regular sugars like sucrose, brown sugar, even honey, and so forth. It could easily turn out, depending on the results of these ongoing studies, that erythritol and xylitol are safe, and I could easily move them up a tier into C tier, if and when that happens. And of course, you'll still have to decide for yourself, do you want to risk those potential cardiovascular concerns of erythritol and xylitol, or the known concerns on liver health and blood sugar, insulin resistance, etc., of eating actual sugars. So none of these are necessarily completely safe, and that's why I'm going to put erythritol and xylitol in D tier for now. Let's move on to sorbitol. This is an easy one. Sorbitol is going to go into C tier. It's similar in calorie density to xylitol. Depending on who you ask, it's somewhat fermentable by oral bacteria, but it also does have some antibacterial effects, so it's not known which of those is greater. It's probably much better for your teeth than regular sugar, but perhaps not as beneficial as erythritol or xylitol. I wasn't able to find any known health risks, so again, this is an easy swap for conventional sugar, as long as you're eating it in relatively low doses, because again, you can have that digestive discomfort at high doses. Now, mannitol and maltitol, as we go down the list here, these sugar alcohols are used much less commonly in food, so we don't really need to focus on them as much. Again, I think these are C tier. Rita, tell us why.
Mannitol and maltitol are approximately 40% and 50% as calorie-dense as sugar, respectively. These sweeteners lack the known antibacterial properties of xylitol and erythritol, but they also don't contribute to tooth decay.
Indeed. C tier it is. And lastly, glycerol. I'm going to put this one in D tier for now, not because of any known health effects, but just because it's one of the most calorie-dense of the sugar alcohols.
Glycerol contains approximately 4.3 calories per gram when burned by inferior organic life forms. Hence, glycerol is 8% more calorie-dense than sugar.
There is probably a nicer way to say that. Now, glycerol is often used as a preservative in oral medications and supplements due to its bacteriostatic qualities. I'm not saying you shouldn't consume glycerol at all, because in those quantities that you would consume in a dietary supplement, the calorie value will be very low or negligible. But as a sweetener in a food or beverage, for example, it would be used in greater amounts and thus contribute more calories. Now note that any of these ratings are subject to change in light of research that finds health risks or the lack of health risks associated with any of them. This is true of all sweeteners we've talked about today, but I'm mentioning this for sugar alcohols specifically since they aren't as well studied as fructose and glucose. That said, there also haven't been any obvious and catastrophic negative health effects associated with any of them either, aside from that study on potential cardiovascular risk with erythritol and xylitol. So that might be good news too. Now, because they lack the risk to blood sugar control, insulin sensitivity, liver health, and tooth decay that's shared by pretty much any real sugar, it's very easy to recommend sugar alcohols in general as an alternative sweetener. Okay, so the last category that we're going to talk about are these low-calorie and non-caloric sweeteners. These include things like aspartame, sucralose, stevia, saccharin, monk fruit extract, and acesulfame potassium. Now, like sugar, these sweeteners won't contribute to tooth decay. They won't spike your blood sugar, so glycemic index is practically zero. They aren't metabolized like fructose, so any of those concerns like lipid accumulation in the liver, increase in VLDL, inflammation, cardiovascular disease, these aren't a known concern with these non-caloric sweeteners either. Unlike sugar alcohols, non-caloric sweeteners are non-caloric.
Thank you for clarifying.
Anytime. So anyways, these sweeteners have 0 calories. Sort of. Not really, but these sweeteners are often hundreds of times sweeter than sugar, so you only need very, very small amounts of them to sweeten a food or beverage, which means that the low amount consumed will add negligible calories to your diet. Now, do be aware, though, that food manufacturers will often blend these sweeteners with other ingredients, either to make them easier to blend into the food, or to mask unusual taste qualities or improve cooking behavior. And so those blended ingredients might be actual sugar or sugar alcohols. So just make sure you're paying attention to those nutrition labels, even for foods sweetened with non-caloric sweeteners. So let's start with aspartame. Now, this one has received media attention recently when the IARC, or International Agency for Research on Cancer, classified aspartame within Group 2B, or possibly carcinogenic. Don't let this concern you too much, though. This rating by the IARC is disputed by other health organizations. The US FDA, for example, disagrees with the IARC's assessment and continues to assess aspartame as non-carcinogenic. The WHO also assessed, in light of that IARC rating, that no change is necessitated in its declared maximum daily safe intake of aspartame. I also want to point out some of the things classified by the IARC in the more risky Group 2A, or probably carcinogenic. Things such as red meat, mate, the caffeine-rich hot beverage traditionally from South America, hot beverages in general above 65 degrees Celsius, being a barber or hairdresser, or working night shifts.
The fragility of meat bags continues to surprise me.
I know, right? So where are we ranking this one?
Aspartame is generally considered safe when consumed within the acceptable daily intake level of 50 mg per kilogram per day by the United States FDA. Non-caloric sweeteners avoid many of the health risks associated with sugar. I recommend placing aspartame within C tier.
I agree. Aspartame has been extremely heavily studied for over 40 years with very good results, especially compared to sugar. Easy C tier. Speaking of well-studied sweeteners, let's talk about sucralose. This is another one that's been in widespread use for decades with lots and lots of safety studies. Sucralose is 600 times sweeter than sugar, and it doesn't cause cancer as far as we know so far. I feel like I need to point that out because there are some older studies that suggested that some artificial sweeteners caused cancer. Now, these results, based on studies in mice, have since been re-evaluated and determined to be inapplicable to humans. Now, there have been some more recent studies on the effects of sucralose on the gut microbiome with mixed results.
Correct. It is possible that long-term sucralose consumption causes changes in the intestinal microbiome. These changes may lead to an unhealthy insulin sensitivity response. However, study results are inconclusive and additional research is needed.
Indeed. Now, the effect of our gut microbiome on health outcomes is a relatively new field of study, and I suspect that sucralose may be studied here just because it's one of the most commonly used artificial sweeteners, not because it's particularly dangerous. Now, that said, this meta-analysis looked at the effects on the gut microbiome of lots of non-caloric sweeteners, from aspartame to sucralose to stevia and more, and they found changes in the gut microbiome with every single non-caloric sweetener. Look, the composition of the gut microbiome can vary widely between individuals, and it can also change in response to our diet. This includes, but is certainly not limited to, the choice of sweeteners we eat in foods. Well, it's becoming increasingly evident that our intestinal bacteria have a significant impact on our health. It's not clear at this time whether changes caused by consumption of specific sweeteners is beneficial, harmful, or neutral. So you can probably guess the result. More data is needed. Now, research is ongoing into how sucralose changes our gut microbiota in ways that can alter inflammation, insulin sensitivity, weight gain, and other results typically associated with actual sugar. And the current results are inconclusive. There's also a bunch of well-known benefits to consuming sucralose in place of sugar. As a result, I'm going to put sucralose in C tier for now, but as always, future research may change this rating. Let's move on to stevia. Now, this is a natural non-caloric sweetener derived from the leaves of the Stevia rebaudiana plant. Now, stevia extract contains a few components, the most prominent of which are about 100 to 300 times sweeter than sucrose. While stevia has been used as a sweetener for a very long time, the purified extracts that are made possible by modern manufacturing have only been used for a short period of time, starting around the 1970s in Japan, and has only been adopted worldwide since the early 2000s. Now, as a result, the health effects of stevia are only just now starting to become known. Some studies have shown that stevia may have favorable effects as an anti-inflammatory and in controlling hypertension. Now, other effects like changes to the gut microbiome and any effects that may have on health are still being studied as they are for other non-caloric sweeteners. Unless ongoing research proves otherwise, stevia should be an easy swap for sugar, especially if you're consuming it in moderation. Easy C tier. Now let's mention monk fruit. So monk fruit extract is a refined non-caloric sweetener that's also around 250 times sweeter than sugar. Like stevia, monk fruit has only seen common worldwide use as a sweetener since around 2010, even though the monk fruit itself has been used historically in traditional Chinese medicine. And again, that just means that modern monk fruit extract is just not very well studied yet. Now, the mogrosides which make up the sweet monk fruit extract may act as antioxidants, though some individuals may experience allergic reaction to it, though that is currently thought to be very rare. Now, given the novelty of monk fruit extract right now, there's not too much I can say against it. As always, more study may change my ranking, but this is going to be, again, a very easy C tier. Okay, last two. Let's talk about saccharin. This is an artificial sweetener that's been around for well over 100 years, though it's only seen widespread popularity as a sweetener since the 1960s and 70s. Now, like many of these low and no calorie sweeteners, saccharin is extremely sweet, around 300 to 500 times sweeter than sugar. Again, that means dosage is going to be very low. Saccharin is another one of the sweeteners that we thought caused cancer, based on some mouse studies decades ago, but that cancer risk in mice was ultimately deemed irrelevant to humans due to some key physiological differences. At risk of repeating myself, research into possible health risks of saccharin are ongoing, but as of now, the known benefits compared to sugar outweigh the potential risks, in my opinion. C tier. And lastly, acesulfame potassium. So this one hasn't been in widespread commercial use quite as long, only since the late 1980s. Now, acesulfame potassium, like the others we've talked about, it's very sweet, about 200 times sweeter than sugar. I don't want to say the same thing over and over again. Rita, tell me something spicy about this acesulfame potassium.
While sugar takes the blame, acesulfame keeps the sweet without the flame.
What?
I'm a rapper now.
You sure are. And we are officially derailed. Get into C tier with the others. A final point on these non-caloric sweeteners. While they do indeed avoid many of the pitfalls of sugar, the evidence that they contribute to weight loss is mixed. And scientists aren't entirely sure yet why these non-caloric sweeteners don't always end up resulting in a reduction in calorie consumption, or if they do, why that reduced calorie consumption doesn't always result in weight loss in practice. Now, in addition to the possible effects on the gut microbiome, some researchers are considering the role of the taste buds. That is, that consuming a sweet-tasting food that doesn't actually deliver glucose may produce some unintended physiological effects. But all of this research is at the very early stages, so we don't have enough information for any definitive conclusions. My point here is to reiterate that none of the sugars or sweeteners we discussed today give us an excuse to eat sweet food to our heart's content. Reducing our intake of artificially sweetened foods, regardless of the sweetener used, will almost always be the optional choice. And that is all we have for today. Thanks for watching, and be safe.